Another language in the island mix was Portuguese. Now, in 1707, the plot to rise up again became before the court, involving some of the slaves as in the 1695 alleged plot, 11 years before. And there's lots of mention of them speaking Portuguese. I'll just give you a little bit. Caesar, Henry Francis's black, says he was at Mr. Webley's, where Mingo said in Portuguese he would break open the powder room and bid him say nothing of it. Caesar says Toby told him so. Toby says he never did, and that Caesar and Mingo talked Portuguese about half an hour together. Presumably these Portuguese blacks were slaves captured by Portuguese slavers, and they learnt that language in the Portuguese holding stations or en route to the island. So, from the evidence that I've presented here, I'm concluding that the slave community used 4 language systems, although not all of the slaves would have spoken all 4. English was the dominant language, and the others were the country languages of the slaves' homelands, Portuguese, or maybe a pidginized Portuguese, and an English which was informed by pidgin features. I don't think there's enough evidence to claim that it was a fully fledged pidgin, if you'll pardon the expression. The speakers who are represented as using pidgin features in the court records all use English as well. Mingo, for example, is represented as speaking English. We're told that he spoke Portuguese, and he also used that word savvy. This is from 1707. On Tuesday last, the Portuguese captain and 2 gentlemen more dined at their house. About an hour after, Mingo came and asked for a dram and some punch, but would not give him any. Whereupon he made answer and said, "If you won't, you may let it alone. It's better you did." And said, "You shall never be the better for it." So went away, saying he did savvy something. Obviously, you've got lots of pronoun elision there, but that's Mingo's speech. So, although the St Helena evidence is slight, it points to a style-shifting situation whereby slaves who commanded more than one language system deployed the varieties in their repertoire according to circumstance. I'm going to finish with a consideration of how the slaves acquired their English. There's evidence in the court records that black slave children were raised by white free planters, and this would have had implications for their speech. The practice was known as putting out, setting out and letting out. The evidence is scattered throughout the records. I'm just going to give you a few little instances from 1712. Captain Hoskisson, having reported that the Honourable Company, being forced to buy yams, the old and useless blacks and children are a great charge to them, wherefore ordered that all the young blacks from 3 years of age be put out to any of the inhabitants that will take them, maintaining them for their service until they come to the age of 10 years, and that notice be given accordingly. So that's the proclamation. 1715, there's this response. Mr. Tovey, according to an order of council of the 26th of July last, further reports that he has taken account of the Honourable Company's blacks let out to several persons. Following. To Dr. Tomlinson, a black fellow called Will, aged about 18 years, had him for no certain time. Mr. French, a black girl called Sarah, aged about 11 years, had her for 3 years, of which above 1 is expired. Dr. Porteus, one wench named Margaret, aged 16 years, had her for no certain time, but upon his petition, he being sickly, she is to live with him 1 year longer. John Bagley, one girl called Ellen, aged 10 years, had her for no certain time. John Robinson, a black boy named Harry, aged about 10 years, had him for no certain time. Now, the significance of this practice is that it shows fragmentation and dispersal of the black families into the whites' households at an age when the young slaves were still linguistically adept and could accommodate to new varieties. Hence, there's no reason to assume that their acquisition of English would have been anything less than native-like. So the scenario that I posit for the St Helena plantations is one where the slaves were not only multilingual, but where pidgin features were used for style shifting. Taking the slave community as a whole, I hypothesise that there would have been a considerable number of country languages, each one used by a subset of the slaves, which indeed could have been very small. Non-standard, uneducated late 16th, early 17th century Southern English. This would have been the island lingua franca and commanded by most, if not all, the slaves to varying degrees of competency. Portuguese, whether native-like or pidginized isn't clear, again a subset of speakers. And a pidginized variety of English, for which there is little but nonetheless some evidence. A single slave may have used his or her country language to their compatriots, English to the wider community at large and the whites, Portuguese to the other slaves who understood it, and pidgin perhaps to newly arrived slaves, or to each other in informal circumstances for reasons perhaps of solidarity, that is, a way of signalling social distance from the white community. There's no evidence that any slave spoke only pidgin English. The The evidence, such as it is, points to the pidgin features being used in addition to English, Portuguese and the country language. Now, I remarked earlier that the slaves did not form a homogeneous speech community in the sense that they came from many first language backgrounds. Neither did they form a single island community, and they can be divided into at least the following groups. Those who lived in whites' households as their servants. Now, those slaves could live as singletons in a family of planters, or, if they worked for a richer family, in small groups. They would have been exposed to much white speech. Those East India Company slaves who lived in the blacks' house at the fort, and who lived and slept together separately from the whites, but who nevertheless interacted with them during the working day. Those East India Company slaves who lived in the blacks' houses on rural plantations, far away from the settlements, who worked in groups in relative isolation, breaking stones, growing yams. They would have been exposed to far less white English. And those male slaves whose main occupation was fishing and who spent the majority of their working day at sea with other males in the company of few other slaves, they too may not have interacted with many white speakers at all. And added to this were the newly arrived slaves who reached the island in adulthood as opposed to the slaves who were born there. The slave community itself was hierarchically organised, as a few select slaves became overseers of the others, and indeed some were even granted their freedom. And all this points to a complicated, socially divided, multilingual speech community. I mentioned at the beginning of this paper that the East India Company's plantations in St Helena may have borne some relation to the plantations in the southern states of the US, though this remains no more than speculation. In the debate about the origins of African American vernacular English, and I'm really overstating this very crudely, there are two opposing hypotheses. That's to say, either Ave is stemming from an earlier Creole stage, or it's stemming from non-standard, non-educated dialectal Southern English. Now, the St Helena data, such as it is, would seem to indicate that these are not two opposing probabilities, but rather they are two compatible possibilities. The purpose of this paper, then, is to add this third scenario to the debate, that pidginized English and 17th century English were both spoken by slaves, and that this scenario might have pertained in plantations spread across the globe. Conditioning factors would have been, for example, whether a slave arrived in adulthood or was born on the plantation, whether a slave lived cooped up with others or dispersed in isolation amongst white families, whether a slave was speaking to compatriots or to other slaves, or whether they were speaking to whites. In other words, code switching and style shifting would have been the norm, but not all slaves would have had equal access to all varieties. The main functional medium shared by all was the colloquial English of the day. A pidginized variety was co-existent, spoken amongst the slave community alone. There's no evidence at all that whites used it. Perhaps I posit for reasons of social solidarity. Thank you very much for listening.